some of you in the breakout rooms, and I know there's an awful lot of wisdom in the room about these kind of issues. So if some of this is familiar to you, then bear with me, please. And there might be others in the room for whom it's not so interesting. So the first activity was this one. We're thinking about from fundamental science to successful policy in action, a long chain of communication. And we were just considering, who do you think is in the chain? So I'll leave it to you to decide which of those characters along the bottom you are and who you're speaking to, as indicated by those arrows. Now, Mark has always given you a sneaky preview of this, what we're calling for the time being a communication value chain. Now, it's not supposed to represent something which is linear. We've heard far too much good stuff already for us to suppose that, but there is in some sense a directionality or a cascade of information. And the sort of people we might think are in this communication cascade are the fundamental scientists who are doing particular areas of research. And then we have scientists with responsibility for a particular domain of decision making. They might be attached to a think tank or a government department. And then they have technical officers who perhaps are also researchers who are trying to assimilate the summaries for the policymakers. So policy designers and policy makers will receive those kind of summaries. They may or may not read the fundamental papers on which it's based. And they are designing policy for the politicians and the lawmakers who are enacting and measuring that policy. And of course, they have a whole bunch of other considerations as well. And then we have disparate communities, industries, organizations, individuals who are affected by this policy. And essentially, it's them that gets to implement it in some sense. So what are the things about fundamental science? Now, the first thing, we talked a lot about language, and I just wanted to talk about a moment about signature pedagogy. So when we're trained in a particular way of thinking, so for example, I'm a mathematician, we have certain ways of knowing. Our epistemology is defined for us. How do we know something is true? So mathematics, it's always proof, and you build your proofs on other people's proofs. For example, if you've got an isosceles triangle and you know one of the angles between the sides and the base, you know the other one because there are rules, and you can then gradually infer measurements about various aspects of that triangle. So sciences live in a world which has been influenced by its cultural and historical context and its values. Some of the difficulties we have in involving women in the hard sciences has come because excellence has been laid down when it was a wholly or mainly male pursuit. And so women seem less excellent in that sense. And when there's a lot of value judgments made about who gets promoted or who gets awarded things, then that can create a biased situation. Any study you might undertake has got a limited study scope. You can't study the entire question of what's wrong with the world. You have to cut it down in some way. And particularly if this is a data-driven project, what you believe will be reflected in your study's design. And my classic example for that one is a colleague at Warwick has done some work on what happens to your hormones when you have disturbed or little sleep. And one of the things that gets affected is your hunger and appetite. So there's a very clear causal pathway or potential causal pathway towards obesity because you are more hungry and less satisfied. However, not very many studies on obesity actually measure sleep. And so that part of the puzzle is actually missing. And that's one of the ways in which data can be missing. It could be biased. The missingness itself can be informative. For example, if you're measuring a particular treatment, say going on a diet to lose weight, the people who don't lose weight or put it back on are less likely to come back to be weighed next time. So that's an informative missingness. And any modelling you might do will have either implicit or hopefully explicit assumptions underpinning it. So scientists with responsibility for a particular domain of policy decision making will be responsible for summarising this technical and highly specific studies for a broader policy context. So they have to synthesise the evidence. They have to evaluate what is and what isn't relevant. And this can be a function of the quality of the communication with the originators of the studies, which studies, which disciplines, which researchers are producing evidence that's relevant. Can be something which is fraught with difficulty. There could be interpersonal problems. The the personal beliefs and understanding of the person concerned or the group concerned might be biased in favour of perhaps quant over qual or something of that nature. So who is it that they are listening to, and what's the unconscious biases? I mean, are they overconfident? Do they listen to the loud voices or the quiet voices? You know, what's available, what's being done. So very often if you're doing interdisciplinary work, you find some really good stuff that's been done in a completely different domain that really speaks to your problem, and you might approach it differently, but you can really lean on those results. So then we have technical officers who are assimilating for summaries for policymakers. And so there's another round of sifting. So the interests and the preferences, even the prejudices of policymakers that they're working for will be important here if they're going to do their job in a way which is acceptable. And there might be interpersonal elements to that communication, and they probably need to add cost-benefit type analyses at this point. So the policy designers and the decision makers are concerned about, is this policy going to be feasible? Is it going to be acceptable? Is it going to make a difference in the time frame that's relevant? And that could be, how close is the next general election, for example? Is it acceptable to the key stakeholders? Who are the key stakeholders? Is it the communities? Is it big business? Who is it? And what are the wider consequences on livelihoods, for example? If we enact this policy, how are we going to run our economy? How are we going to make sure that everyone has access to work, meaningful work, and a means of supporting themselves? And in any change, there are going to be winners and losers, and who are those going to be? So when we come to the politicians and the lawmakers, there's a political acceptability of the policy, and then acceptability to whom is the question. There are key political stakeholders. How much is this going to cost? What is the political landscape of the communities most affected? Are they my key constituents that I really want to keep happy or not? And how do they interact with other policies? Are other policies going to be changed by this? Perhaps another policy is going to be damaged by this, or perhaps they're just going to cancel each other out, in which case, what's the point? And there's incentives and disincentives. They might have to enact along with the law. If you don't do this, you will get put in prison or fined or whatever. If you do this, we'll contribute something towards your income or some other thing. And then what about compensation? We think about HS2 and the compensation that needs to be paid out for people who've had to move out to make way for the train, for example. So there are all those kind of considerations to be taken into account. And then who are the thought leaders in each sector, in each community? So very often we find in the work that I do in sort of poverty and food insecurity, there are key community influencers, if you like, who are the go-to people. If this person or this family or this group of people say, yes, this is a good idea, we will do this for our community, then you'll get a lot more take up than if you, there's somebody doing it to them, as it were. What are the motivations and incentives? What's the motivation for me versus my motivation for the benefit of my community? Or what are the cultural issues and the linguistics, for example? And of course, this will depend on the political situation. It's different in a democracy than in a more top-down kind of a community. So look, we have the motivation problem. So people will need to do what they need to do to meet their basic needs. They need food and shelter and warmth before they can be concerned about creating a future, for example. And we have to realise that threats to resource are not distributed equally within society. But at the same time, human support and action is needed for change. We have to recognise people have complex motivations. And again, the deficit model, whereas, if only you understood what I understood, you would do differently, is a really poor model to have in your mind when you are actually trying to speak to people about these kinds of things. And we have to remember that scientists, policymakers, politicians are also part of communities. We all live somewhere, we all have hobbies that we enjoy and so on. So in The Guardian this week, and thank you for Belina for pointing this to me, there was a really interesting article about rewilding and why rewilding success is about people and not trees. And in that policy, in that program, they actually elucidated why it was important to talk to the different actors within that community where the trees were going to be planted and find out what it would mean for them. And there was one particular individual who had no particular time for trees, but what he really, really wanted to do, what he's passionate about, was the levelling up agenda and removing poverty in the rural areas. And when the rewilding policymakers or enactors were able to speak to them and say, well, actually, if we work with you in this particular way, we can do the rewilding in such a way that's going to create jobs and good income. So engaging people, whether it's through citizen science, through debates, strategy, is really, really important. And most people just really superficially monitor their environment. They don't have time or the interest to read in any depth. One of the things we really take on board when we're working with people who are in low incomes is nothing about me without me is for me. So I think I'll leave it there because I have run out of time, but obviously the slides will be available later. And what I really wanted to say is that the value chain is long and complex. And there are many similarities and barriers at every stage. And the strategies may differ depending on specific audiences. So I'm going to hand over now to Freya, who's going to give us some differentiated strategies for science writing in different audiences.